The ground shook beneath their feet as another explosion rocked the ancient ruins. Dust and fragments of crystalline stone rained down from what remained of the towering spires that had once reached toward the stars. The mining crew had been working this site for 3 weeks, carefully extracting valuable minerals from the collapsed civilization, when the tremors started. "Everyone back to the shuttles," shouted Foreman Blake, his voice barely audible over the rumbling chaos. "This whole place is coming down." The human salvage team scattered, grabbing their equipment and running for safety. But Private Wilson heard something else beneath the thunder of falling stone, a sound that made him stop in his tracks, even as his teammates continued their desperate retreat. It was crying. Not human crying, but something else. Something small and frightened and alone. Wilson turned back toward the ruins, ignoring Blake's angry shouts. The sound was coming from beneath a pile of shimmering debris, where one of the smaller towers had collapsed. "There's something alive under there," Wilson called out, dropping to his knees and beginning to dig through the rubble with his bare hands. The stones were warm to the touch and seemed to glow with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Engineer Lopez reached him, first followed quickly by Dr. Park, the team's medic. "What are you doing, Wilson? We need to go now." "Listen," Wilson insisted, pausing in his digging. "Do you hear that?" They all stopped and listened. There it was again, a soft, musical sound that tugged at something deep in their chests. It sounded like wind chimes mixed with a kitten's mew, but sadder somehow, more desperate. Without another word, Lopez began helping Wilson move the debris. Dr. Park joined them, her medical training overriding her survival instincts. Even Foreman Blake, after cursing under his breath, grabbed a pry bar and started working to lift the larger pieces. The crying grew louder as they dug deeper. Whatever was trapped beneath the stones was definitely alive and definitely suffering. Wilson's hands were bleeding from the sharp edges of the crystalline rubble, but he kept digging. They all did. "Got something," Lopez yelled, pulling away a section of twisted metal that might have once been part of a decorative arch. "I can see movement." Dr. Park pushed forward with her scanner, trying to get readings through the remaining debris. "Life signs are weak, but stable. Whatever it is, it's small. Maybe the size of a house cat." They worked faster now, carefully removing each piece of rubble. The ruins continued to shake around them, but none of them stopped. The crying had become more urgent, as if their trapped victim knew rescue was close. Finally, Wilson's hands touched something warm and soft. Something that moved. "I've got it," he announced, gently scooping up what felt like a small animal wrapped in his jacket to protect it from the sharp stones. When they finally reached the safety of their shuttle, and Dr. Park got her first good look at what they had rescued, she nearly dropped her medical kit. "That's impossible," she whispered. Lying in Wilson's arms, wrapped in his torn jacket, was a baby dragon. It was tiny, no bigger than a small dog, with scales that shifted color, from deep purple to silver in the shuttle's lights. Its wings were folded against its back, and its long tail curled around Wilson's arm like a security blanket. Most striking were its eyes. Large, golden, and ancient beyond anything that should belong to a creature so young. "Dragons don't exist," Lopez said flatly. "They're myths, stories." The baby dragon chose that moment to open its mouth and let out another cry. This time, they could see tiny fangs and smell something like cinnamon and starlight on its breath. "Tell that to him," Wilson said, gently stroking the creature's head. The dragon's crying stopped immediately, replaced by a sound like purring, mixed with musical notes. Dr. Park ran her scanner over the small form. Multiple injuries, broken ribs, internal bleeding, severe dehydration. But the readings are all wrong. Its body temperature is too high, its heart rate is too slow, and I'm detecting some kind of energy field around it. "Will it live?" Blake asked quietly. Despite his gruff exterior, the foreman was clearly moved by the tiny creature's plight. "I don't know," Park admitted. "I've never treated anything like this before, but I'll do my best." The flight back to War, their base, took 2 hours. The baby dragon slept most of the way, occasionally stirring to make soft sounds that seemed almost like words in a language none of them recognized. Wilson held it the entire time, unwilling to let go of the fragile life they had saved. Their base was a modest affair built into the side of a mountain on the planet's third continent. It housed 43 humans who had come to this world seeking a new life away from the crowded colonies of the inner systems. They were miners, farmers, engineers, and dreamers who had pooled their resources to purchase mining rights on this forgotten world. When Wilson walked into the main hall carrying his precious cargo, conversation stopped. People gathered around, staring in wonder at the impossible creature. "Is that what I think it is?" asked Mechanic Torres, her eyes wide. "It's a dragon," Wilson confirmed. "A baby dragon. We found it in the ruins." The creature stirred at the sound of voices opening, those ancient golden eyes. It looked around at all the human faces surrounding it, then made a decision that would change everything. It struggled out of Wilson's arms and on unsteady legs walked to the center of the group. Then it sat down and began to cry again. But this wasn't the desperate crying they had heard in the ruins. This was different, more demanding. It looked from face to face as if trying to decide which human would be most likely to help with whatever it needed. Dr. Park knelt down beside it, speaking softly. "Hey there, little one, are you hungry?" The crying stopped immediately. The dragon tilted its head, studying Park with those knowing eyes. Then it stood up, walked over to her, and very deliberately sat on her feet. "I think that's a yes," someone laughed. "What are we going to call it?" asked Cook Martinez, already moving toward the kitchen. "Can't just keep saying it and the dragon." Wilson looked down at the small creature, now rubbing against Dr. Park's legs like an oversized cat. "How about Pip? It's small and it makes all those musical sounds." The dragon looked up at the sound of its new name and made an approving chirp. Then it walked back to Wilson and very carefully climbed up his leg to perch on his shoulder. "Pip, it is," Blake said with a grin. "Welcome to the family, little guy." Over the next few days, Dr. Park worked tirelessly to heal Pip's injuries. Her medical bay became the dragon's temporary home, filled with soft blankets and warming lights. The entire community took turns visiting, bringing small gifts and offering help. But it was Wilson that Pip bonded with most strongly. Whenever the young private entered the room, the dragon would immediately perk up and rush over to greet him. When Wilson had to leave for work duties, Pip would sit by the door and wait for his return. "He thinks you're his parent," Dr. Park observed one evening as she watched Pip curl up in Wilson's lap. "Maybe I am," Wilson replied quietly, gently stroking the dragon's scales. "We saved each other, I think." As if agreeing, Pip made a contented sound that filled the room with warmth. For the first time since their rescue, the baby dragon seemed truly at peace. None of them knew that their simple act of kindness would soon change the course of human history forever. 3 weeks had passed since Pip arrived at the human settlement, and Dr. Park was amazed by how quickly the little dragon had healed. His broken ribs had mended faster than should have been possible. His energy had returned, and he had grown, noticeably larger. What surprised everyone most, however, was discovering that Pip had a very strong personality. It started small. Dr. Park noticed that Pip would push his food bowl around the medical bay until it was positioned exactly where he wanted it. If someone moved it even a few inches, he would drag it back to his preferred spot with great determination. At first, they thought it was cute. Then came the great food rebellion of Tuesday morning. Dr. Park had prepared Pip's usual breakfast, a mixture of protein paste and mineral supplements that her scanner indicated would provide proper nutrition for a growing dragon. She placed the bowl in its usual spot and went to check on her medical supplies. Behind her, the most horrible sound imaginable erupted from Pip's throat. Wah! The noise was unlike anything any of them had heard before. It started as a high-pitched shriek, dropped to a rumbling growl, then rose again to something that sounded like a dying star having an emotional breakdown. The sound echoed off the walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Dr. Park spun around to find Pip sitting beside his untouched food bowl, his head thrown back in the most dramatic display of anguish she had ever witnessed. Tears, actual crystal-clear tears, rolled down his snout as he continued his operatic wailing. "What's wrong?" Park asked, rushing to his side. "Are you hurt?" Pip stopped crying immediately and looked at her with those ancient golden eyes. Then he very deliberately pushed the bowl away with his nose and looked back at her expectantly. "You don't want your food?" Pip shook his head, a gesture he had learned from watching the humans. Then he walked over to the corner where Dr. Park kept various medical supplies, including a container of blue nutrient gel she used for treating dehydrated patients. "You want the blue gel?" Park asked, confused. Pip nodded enthusiastically, his tail wagging like a happy puppy. "But Pip, this is medicine, not food. It's not good for you to eat all the time." The dragon's expression changed instantly. His lower lip, if dragons could be said to have lower lips, began to quiver. His eyes grew wide and sad, filling with more of those crystal tears. Then he threw himself dramatically onto the floor and began the wailing again. This time with added theatrical gestures. He rolled onto his back, tiny legs kicking in the air. He covered his eyes with his claws and made the most pitiful sounds imaginable. When that didn't work, he crawled across the floor to Park's feet and collapsed there, draping himself across her boots like a creature on the verge of death. Thew. Performance was so over the top, so completely ridiculous that Dr. Park couldn't help but laugh, which only made Pip cry harder. "What in the seven hells is that noise?" Foreman Blake demanded, bursting through the door with several other colonists behind him. They stopped short when they saw Pip sprawled across the floor, still wailing with tremendous enthusiasm while Dr. Park stood over him trying not to laugh. "He doesn't like his breakfast," Park explained. "He wants the blue medical gel instead." Engineer Lopez stared at the scene in disbelief. The legendary terror of the void is throwing a tantrum over food? As if understanding the insult, Pip's cries grew even louder. He added new elements too. His performance, including what appeared to be fake coughing and the occasional dramatic gasp for breath. Wilson pushed through the crowd and immediately dropped to his knees beside Pip. The dragon opened one eye, saw his favorite human, and instantly stopped crying. He launched himself into Wilson's arms, purring and making happy sounds. There, Wilson said softly, stroking Pip's scales. "What's got you so upset?" Pip made a series of chirping sounds while pointing his snout toward the blue gel container. Wilson looked at Dr. Park questioningly. "He wants the medical gel instead of his regular food," she explained. "But it's not nutritionally appropriate for everyday meals." Wilson looked down at Pip, who was now gazing up at him with the most hopeful expression imaginable. "How about a compromise, buddy? What if we mix a little bit of the blue gel with your regular food? Would that work?" Pip considered this proposal seriously, his head tilted to one side. After a moment, he nodded graciously, as if he were a king granting a reasonable request from his subjects. Dr. Park shook her head in amazement as she prepared the mixed meal. "I can't believe I'm negotiating with a baby dragon over breakfast preferences." But the negotiations were far from over. As Pip grew more comfortable in his new home, his demands became increasingly elaborate. He decided that eating from the floor was beneath his dignity and would only accept meals served at table height. When the humans tried to ignore this new requirement, Pip launched into another spectacular tantrum that lasted for 2 hours. The sound brought half the colony running, convinced they were under attack. Instead, they found Pip lying on his back in the middle of the medical bay, legs kicking wildly, producing sounds that seemed to combine the worst aspects of a screaming child, a dying cat, and a malfunctioning starship engine. "This is ridiculous," muttered Mechanic Torres, but she was already moving toward the supply closet to find something that could serve as a proper dining table for their demanding guest. The sleeping arrangements caused the next major crisis. Pip had claimed Dr. Park's desk chair as his favorite napping spot. When she tried to move him so she could work, he responded with what could only be called a performance piece worthy of the greatest dramatic actors in human space. First, he tried the subtle approach, making small, sad sounds while gazing at Park with those huge golden eyes. When that didn't work, he escalated to medium-level whimpering while covering his face with his claws in a gesture of pure despair. Still unsuccessful, Pip threw himself against the medical bay door, slid down it dramatically, then crawled across the floor with such exaggerated suffering that several colonists gathered to watch what they had dubbed Pip's daily drama show. The grand finale came when he positioned himself directly in front of Park's desk, and began producing the most heart-wrenching sounds imaginable while alternately pointing at the chair and covering his eyes. It was pure emotional manipulation, and everyone knew it. It worked perfectly. Dr. Park lasted exactly 3 minutes before moving to sit on the floor so Pip could have his precious chair. The dragon immediately perked up, jumped onto the chair, circled 3 times, and curled up for his nap with a satisfied sigh. "He's got us all wrapped around his little claws," observed Cook Martinez, who had been watching from the doorway. "And the worst part is we're letting him get away with it. Look at that face," Wilson said, pointing to where Pip was now sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. How could anyone say no to that face? As if sensing the attention, Pip opened one golden eye, looked around, at all the humans watching him, made a contented chirping sound, and went back to sleep. The colonists exchanged glances and shook their heads. They were being manipulated by a baby dragon, and they all knew it. But somehow none of them minded very much. After all, Pip brought something to their small community that they hadn't realized they were missing. He brought joy, laughter, and the daily reminder that even the most legendary creatures in the galaxy could be adorably ridiculous when they were still babies. Even if those babies had very strong opinions about proper meal presentation and furniture arrangements. 2 months after his rescue, Pip had grown to the size of a medium dog and had perfected the art of dramatic suffering to a level that would have impressed professional actors across the galaxy. His tantrums had become so elaborate and entertaining that some of the colonists had started keeping schedules so they wouldn't miss the daily performances. The morning of what would later be remembered as the Great Grooming Crisis began when Pip discovered his reflection in Dr. Park's medical scanner screen. He spent several minutes admiring himself, turning his head this way and that to catch the light on his scales, preening like a peacock. Then he noticed a small smudge on one of his silver scales, and his entire world fell apart. Pip tried to clean the spot himself, twisting and contorting in ways that should have been impossible for any creature with a spine. When he couldn't reach it, he sat down and stared at his reflection with growing horror. The smudge was still there, completely ruining his perfect appearance. What happened next would go down in colony history. Pip walked slowly to where Private Wilson was eating breakfast and sat down directly in front of him. He didn't make a sound. He simply sat there staring at Wilson with the most tragic expression ever seen on any creature's face. "Morning, Pip," Wilson said cheerfully, not looking up from his meal. "Sleep well?" Pip made a tiny heartbroken sound and gently placed one claw on Wilson's knee. Wilson looked down and saw the dragon gazing up at him with eyes full of unimaginable sorrow. "What's wrong, buddy? Are you hungry?" Pip shook his head slowly, then stood up and turned around, pointing with his snout toward the offensive smudge on his scales. He looked back at Wilson with an expression that clearly said, "Look at this disaster that has befallen me." "You've got a little dirt on your scales?" Wilson asked, trying to understand. "It's not a big deal, Pip, you can clean it off." The dragon's eyes widened in shock at this suggestion. Clean it off himself? Like some common creature? The very idea was apparently so offensive that Pip began to tremble with outrage. He sat down again and fixed Wilson with a stare that somehow managed to convey both desperate need and wounded dignity. Then he began to cry, not the dramatic over-the-top wailing of his previous tantrums. This was different. These were quiet, dignified tears that spoke of a creature suffering a terrible injustice with noble grace. It was heartbreaking and completely ridiculous at the same time. "You want me to clean it for you?" Wilson asked, beginning to understand. Pip nodded eagerly, his tears stopping instantly. He turned around and sat perfectly still, waiting for Wilson to attend to his grooming needs. "Pip, you're a dragon, a mighty legendary creature. You can clean yourself." The tears resumed immediately, this time accompanied by small wounded sounds that suggested Wilson had just broken the dragon's heart into 1,000 pieces. Engineer Lopez walked into the dining area just in time to witness Wilson carefully, cleaning a tiny smudge off Pip's scales with a soft cloth while the dragon sat motionless, occasionally making approving sounds. "Please tell me you're not seriously grooming him like a pet," Lopez said. "He was crying," Wilson explained defensively. "Really sad crying. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to let him clean himself like every other living creature in the universe, Lopez replied. But even as she said it, she watched Pip turn to Wilson with a grateful expression and nuzzle his hand affectionately. The grooming crisis was nothing compared to the great nap time incident that occurred that same afternoon. Pip had established a very specific nap schedule that involved sleeping on Foreman Blake's desk chair at exactly 2 o'clock every day. The chair was positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, and Blake had grudgingly accepted that his office was now a dragon nursery during certain hours. But on this particular day, Blake had an important communication scheduled with the colonial administration. He needed to use his office, and more importantly, he needed to sit in his own chair. "Sorry, Pip," Blake said firmly when 2 o'clock arrived and the dragon appeared for his scheduled nap. "Not today. I've got work to do." Pip stared at Blake, in confusion. This had never happened before. His nap time was sacred. It was understood by all humans that between 2 and 4 o'clock the chair belonged to him. The dragon walked over to the chair and looked up at Blake sitting in it. He made a small questioning sound, clearly expecting the human to move. "No, Pip, I need to work. You can nap somewhere else today." The suggestion that he could nap somewhere else appeared to shock Pip to his very core. His eyes grew wide with disbelief. His mouth fell open. He took several steps backward as if the very words had physically pushed him. Then he sat down and began to stare at Blake with the most accusatory expression imaginable. It was a look that said, "I trusted you. And this is how you repay me?" "Don't give me that look," Blake warned. "I have important business to conduct." Pip's response was to lie down on the floor and begin making the most pitiful sounds ever heard. Not loud crying this time, but soft, wounded whimpers that suggested his heart was slowly breaking. He stretched out one claw toward the chair, as if reaching for something precious that was being cruelly kept from him. Blake tried to ignore the performance and focus on his work, but it was impossible. Every few seconds, Pip would make another heartbroken sound, each one more pitiful than the last. The dragon's dramatic skills had evolved considerably over the past 2 months. He had learned that different situations called for different types of emotional manipulation. The loud, theatrical tantrums worked well for food-related disputes, but this situation called for something more subtle and devastating. Pip rolled onto his side and began making tiny, gasping sounds, as if the shock of being denied his nap spot was causing him physical pain. He would occasionally lift his head to look at Blake with wounded eyes, then let it fall back to the floor with a soft thud. "This is ridiculous," Blake muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Pip heard the uncertainty and pressed his advantage. He crawled closer to Blake's chair, never taking his eyes off the foreman's face. When he was close enough, he very gently placed his head on Blake's boot and made the smallest, saddest sound imaginable. Blake lasted another 30 seconds before he cracked. "Fine," he said, standing up abruptly. "Take the chair, but this is the last time you hear me. Tomorrow we're setting some boundaries." Pip perked up immediately, his tragic demeanor vanishing as if it had never existed. He jumped into the chair, circled 3 times, and settled down for his nap with obvious satisfaction. Blake moved to a different chair and tried to focus on his work, but found himself watching Pip sleep peacefully in the afternoon sunlight. Despite his frustration, he couldn't help but smile slightly. The little dragon looked so content, so perfectly at peace that it was hard to stay angry. "You're getting too good at this, aren't you?" Blake said quietly. Pip opened one golden eye, looked at Blake for a moment, made a soft, contented sound. That might have been agreement, and went back to sleep. Word of Pip's increasingly elaborate tantrums began to spread beyond the colony. Trade ships that stopped for supplies would hear stories of the dramatic baby dragon, who had trained an entire settlement of humans to cater to his every whim. Some visitors dismissed the tales as exaggeration, but others found themselves staying, longer than planned, hoping to witness one of Pip's legendary performances. The dragon seemed to understand that he had an audience and began tailoring his shows accordingly. When strangers were present, his tantrums became even more theatrical, complete with sound effects and dramatic pauses that would have impressed seasoned performers. But it was the quiet moments that truly won hearts. The way Pip would curl up, in Wilson's lap during evening meals, how he would follow Dr. Park around the medical bay trying to help with her work. The gentle sounds he made when the colonists were sad or stressed. Pip was becoming more than just a rescued creature. He was becoming family. A spoiled, dramatic, completely ridiculous family member who had somehow managed to wrap 43 tough colonists around his tiny claws. The transport ship arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, its sleek hull gleaming despite the gray clouds overhead. Commander West stepped off the landing ramp with the kind of confidence that came from commanding starfleets across 3 sectors. She had traveled halfway across known space to see something that her intelligence reports claimed was impossible: a baby dragon living peacefully among humans. "Where is this creature?" she asked without preamble as Foreman Blake approached to greet her. "Probably having his morning tantrum about breakfast," Blake replied with the weary tone of a man who had surrendered to forces beyond his control. "Right on schedule." As if summoned by his words, the unmistakable sound of Pip's displeasure erupted from the dining hall. This morning's performance involved his discovery that Cook Martinez had dared to serve his favorite fish paste in a round bowl instead of the oval one he preferred. Commander West stopped walking and listened to the sounds echoing through the settlement. What she heard was unlike anything in her extensive experience with alien life forms. It was a complex symphony of outrage that seemed to combine operatic vocals with the dramatic flair of classical theater. "That's him," Blake confirmed. "We call him Pip." They entered the dining hall to find the morning's drama in full swing. Pip sat in front of his rejected breakfast, his head thrown back in an expression of pure anguish. He had one claw pressed dramatically to his forehead, while the other gestured toward the offending round bowl as if it were evidence of humanity's greatest failure. Between his theatrical wails, he would pause to look around and make sure everyone was watching his performance. When he spotted the newcomer in her crisp uniform, his eyes widened with interest. A new audience meant an opportunity to really showcase his talents. Pip immediately switched tactics. He abandoned the dramatic suffering routine and instead approached Commander West with the most dignified walk he could manage. His little chest puffed out proudly, his tail held high and his head tilted at an angle that somehow conveyed both nobility and curiosity. "Remarkable," West murmured, kneeling down to study the dragon more closely. "The reports didn't exaggerate. He's actually trying to impress me." Pip sat down directly in front of her and extended one claw in what appeared to be a formal greeting. When West cautiously extended her hand, Pip very gently touched her fingers with his claw, then made a sound that was clearly meant to be welcoming. "He's showing off," Private Wilson explained as he entered the dining hall. "He always does that with visitors. Watch this." Wilson walked over to the rejected breakfast bowl and made a show of examining it carefully. "Oh no, Pip! They gave you—" "The wrong bowl again. How terrible." Pip nodded enthusiastically, pleased that someone finally understood the gravity of the situation. Wilson picked up the round bowl and carried it to the kitchen, returning moments later with an identical meal, served in Pip's preferred oval bowl. "There you go, buddy, much better." Pip inspected the new presentation carefully, nodded his approval, then began eating with obvious satisfaction. Between bites, he looked up at Commander West as if to say, "You see how these things should be handled properly." "Unbelievable," West said, shaking her head. "A legendary apex predator is concerned about dishware geometry." "You should see him when someone sits in his chair," Cook Martinez called from the kitchen. "Last week he staged a 3-hour protest that included what I swear was a hunger strike." Commander West spent the next several hours observing Pip's daily routine. She witnessed the Great Toy Incident, where Pip discovered that someone had moved his favorite chew toy 6 inches from its proper location. His response involved a carefully choreographed display of searching, confusion, and mounting panic until Wilson moved the toy back to its designated spot. She watched the afternoon grooming ritual, where Pip would sit perfectly still while Dr. Park brushed his scales to a mirror shine. If Park missed even the smallest spot, Pip would gently guide her hand to the neglected area with the patience of a master teaching a slow student. Most impressive was the evening entertainment hour, where Pip had apparently appointed himself as the colony's morale officer. He would visit each person, making cheerful sounds and performing small tricks he had learned. Rolling over, standing on his hind legs, and even a clumsy attempt at what might have been dancing. He's adapted completely to human social structure, West observed as she watched Pip curl up in Wilson's lap during dinner. But he's also trained all of you to adapt to his needs. We know, Dr. Park said with a laugh. We're all completely under his control, and we're fine with it. The next morning brought the most spectacular tantrum Commander West had yet witnessed. Pip had apparently decided that the settlement's daily schedule was all wrong and needed immediate correction. It started when he noticed that Engineer Lopez was working on equipment maintenance at 9 o'clock instead of 10 o'clock, which was when he had decided maintenance should happen. Pip marched over to Lopez's workstation and began making pointed sounds while gesturing toward the clock on the wall. When Lopez continued working, not understanding what the dragon wanted, Pip escalated. He positioned himself between Lopez and her tools, spread his wings as wide as they would go, and began what could only be described as a lecture. The sounds he made were clearly meant to be words, though no human could understand the language. He would point at the clock, then at Lopez, then at the tools, all while making increasingly emphatic vocalizations. His tone suggested he was explaining something very important that any reasonable being should understand immediately. I think he's trying to reorganize our work schedule, Blake said, watching the performance with amazement. Pip heard his name mentioned and trotted over to Blake, chittering excitedly. He led Blake to a wall where someone had posted the daily duty roster, then began making urgent sounds while pointing at various entries. You want to change the schedule? Blake asked. Pip nodded vigorously, then ran to Dr. Park's desk and somehow managed to drag a writing stylus back to the duty roster. He dropped it at Blake's feet and looked up expectantly. He wants me to rewrite the schedule according to his preferences? More enthusiastic nodding from Pip, who was practically bouncing with excitement at finally being understood. Blake looked at Commander West, who was staring at the scene in disbelief. A baby dragon is trying to manage our daily operations, and apparently doing a better job than some administrators I know, West replied. What happens if you don't do what he wants? As if to answer her question, Pip realized that Blake was hesitating. The dragon's expression shifted from excitement to concern, then to the heartbroken look that had become his signature move for getting his way. He sat down slowly, his shoulders sagging in defeat. His head drooped until his chin nearly touched the floor. Then he made the smallest, saddest sound imaginable and began walking away with the slow, tragic gait of someone whose heart had been shattered by disappointment. Blake lasted approximately 15 seconds. Fine, he called after Pip. We'll try. Your schedule for one day. But if it doesn't work, we're changing it back. Pip spun around immediately, his tragic demeanor replaced by pure joy. He rushed back to Blake and began jumping up and down with excitement, making happy chirping sounds that filled the entire room with warmth. Commander West shook her head in wonder. In my 30 years of military service, I have never seen anything like this. A baby dragon has just negotiated a change in operational procedure through emotional manipulation. Welcome to life with Pip, Wilson said with a grin. He runs this place and we just try to keep up. The dragon in question had already moved on to his next project, apparently deciding that the furniture arrangement in the common area needed his immediate attention. He was pushing chairs around with his nose while making thoughtful sounds, clearly designing a better layout for human social interaction. Commander West realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just first contact with dragons, but the development of a completely new form of interspecies cooperation based on mutual affection and the most adorable manipulation tactics ever recorded. 6 months had passed since Pip's rescue, and the little dragon had grown to the size of a large dog. His scales had taken on a deeper luster, and his wings had developed enough that he could manage short gliding flights around the settlement. What had not changed was his talent for dramatic performances and his ability to get exactly what he wanted from every human in the colony. The morning that would change everything started with Pip's newest tantrum, which the colonists had dubbed the Great Dignity Crisis. He had decided that walking on the ground like an ordinary creature was beneath his status as a dragon and demanded to be carried everywhere by his favorite humans. Dr. Park discovered this new development when she found Pip sitting by the medical bay door refusing to enter. When she tried to coax him inside, he made a series of imperious sounds and gestured toward her arms with clear expectation. "You want me to carry you?" Park asked, genuinely confused. Pip nodded regally, then lifted, his front legs in the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up. When Park hesitated, he began the patented Pip treatment. His golden eyes filled with tears of wounded pride, his lower lip trembled with injured dignity, and he made small sounds that suggested her refusal was causing him physical pain. "This is getting ridiculous," Park muttered, but she was already bending down to lift the dragon. Pip immediately perked up and made satisfied sounds as she carried him into the medical bay like royalty being transported to court. The dignity crisis spread throughout the day as Pip applied his new transportation requirements to every human in the settlement. He would position himself in doorways, sitting perfectly still with an expectant expression until someone carried him through. If anyone suggested he could walk perfectly well on his own, he would launch into a performance that suggested walking was now physically impossible for a creature of his elevated status. By noon, the entire colony was carrying Pip from place to place, while he rode in their arms like a furry, scaly emperor surveying his domain. "We've created a monster," Foreman Blake complained as he carried Pip to the communications center. "A adorable, manipulative monster." Pip responded by patting Blake's arm affectionately and making agreeable sounds, as if to say, "Yes, but I'm your monster." The afternoon brought visitors that would change everything. The proximity alarms chimed softly, indicating an approaching spacecraft, but this wasn't the harsh blare that announced unknown vessels. The computer recognized the ship's signature and classified it as peaceful, though the design was unlike anything in human databases. Through the main viewing port, the colonists watched a vessel that seemed to be grown rather than built descend from the clouds. Its surface was smooth and organic, with curves that flowed like living tissue. Colors shifted across its hull in patterns that resembled breathing. Pip, who had been in the middle of training Cook Martinez to hand-feed him his afternoon snack, suddenly went very still. His head snapped up, and his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the settlement. He made a sound none of them had ever heard before, a musical note that seemed to resonate in their bones. "What is it, buddy?" Wilson asked, reaching out to stroke Pip's scales. But Pip was no longer the playful, demanding baby they knew. Something ancient and knowing had awakened in his golden eyes. He slipped out of Martinez's arms and walked to the nearest window, pressing his nose against the glass as he watched the strange ship land. The vessel touched down in the settlement's main landing area with barely a whisper of displaced air. No landing ramp emerged. Instead, a section of the hull simply flowed, aside like liquid, creating an opening. What stepped out was unmistakably a dragon, but unlike anything the humans had imagined. She was enormous, easily 3 times the height of a human, with scales that shifted through every color of the rainbow. Her wings were folded against her back, and her neck curved in a graceful S shape that spoke of incredible strength held in perfect control. Behind her came others, dragons of different sizes and colors, all moving with the same fluid grace. But it was the first one, clearly their leader, who commanded attention. Her presence filled the entire landing area with a sense of ancient wisdom and barely contained power. Pip made another musical sound, higher and more urgent this time. He began scratching at the window, clearly desperate to get outside. "I think," Dr. Park said quietly, "we're about to meet Pip's family." The lead dragon approached the settlement's main entrance and stopped. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the walls, resonating in harmonics that human ears could barely process. "Greetings, small ones," she said in perfect standard. "We have come for the lost child. We know he is here." Commander West, who had extended her stay to study Pip's behavior, took charge of the situation. She activated the external communication system and replied carefully. "We have a young dragon in our care. We found him injured in some ruins and have been helping him recover." The small flame called Pip the dragon said, and there was unmistakable warmth in her voice. We felt his awakening songs. He calls to us now. In the settlement, Pip was becoming increasingly agitated. He had moved away from the window and was now pacing back and forth, making urgent sounds. But when he looked at his human family, his expression was conflicted. The ancient knowing in his eyes warred with the affection he clearly felt for the people who had raised him. "You are his mother?" Wilson asked, his voice tight with emotion he was trying to hide. "I am Sarah, elder of the Western Reaches. The small flame is my youngest offspring. We thought him lost in the destruction of the singing spires." Pip heard his mother's voice and made a sound that was part joy, part longing, and part something that sounded almost like an apology. He looked around at all the humans who had become his family, then sat down in the middle of the room and began to cry. But these weren't the dramatic, manipulative tears of his daily tantrums. These were real tears of a creature torn between two worlds, two families, two ways of being. "Can we bring him out to you?" Commander West asked. "If he wishes to come," Sarah replied. "But I sense his heart is divided. Perhaps we should speak, first all of us together." The next hour was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Dragons and humans sat together in the settlement's main hall, while Pip moved between both groups like a living bridge between two species. Sarah watched with obvious amusement as Pip demonstrated his favorite tantrum techniques for the assembled dragons. When he showed them his tragic suffering pose, complete with dramatic head-tossing and fake gasping, several of the younger dragons began making sounds that could only be described as laughter. "He has learned much from you," Sarah observed, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been pride. "These emotional expression techniques are quite sophisticated." "He's trained us well," Blake admitted. "We can't say no to him when he gives us those looks." "Ah," Sarah said knowingly. "The ancient art of youngling manipulation. He shows great talent for it." Pip, hearing himself being discussed, decided this was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his skills. He positioned himself in the center of the group and began his greatest performance yet, a combination of all his most effective techniques designed to show both dragons and humans exactly how beloved and important he was. He started with the wounded dignity approach, walking slowly around the circle with his head held high but his eyes filled with tragic nobility. Then he shifted to helpless baby, making tiny sounds while looking up at various faces with huge innocent eyes. The finale was pure, dramatic suffering, complete with carefully timed gasps and strategic use of those crystal tears. The performance was so over the top, so completely ridiculous that both species found themselves laughing together. "He is quite the little actor," Sarah said fondly. "But I see something more. He has brought you joy, has he not? And you have given him love." Wilson nodded, unable to speak as he watched Pip bask in the attention from both groups. "Then perhaps," Sarah continued, "we can find a way for him to keep both families. The old ways assumed dragons and humans could never understand each other, but this small flame has proven otherwise." Pip perked up at these words, sensing that something important was being decided. He trotted over to Sarah and then back to Wilson, then back to Sarah again, as if trying to physically demonstrate his desire to belong to both worlds. "What are you suggesting?" Commander West asked. Sarah smiled, an expression that was somehow both terrifyingly magnificent and utterly gentle. "I am suggesting that this settlement has just become the first joint dragon-human colony in galactic history. If you are willing, some of my people would like to stay and learn more about these fascinating emotional manipulation techniques." Pip, apparently understanding that he had achieved the impossible, immediately threw himself into a celebration tantrum that could be heard 3 systems away. It was a sound of pure joy, dramatic triumph, and complete satisfaction with how perfectly everything had worked out according to his plans. Some things, the humans realized, never change. Even when those things become the foundation for a new era of interspecies cooperation, built on mutual affection and the most adorable emotional manipulation in the known galaxy.